what's the next set of challenges that we're going to be grappling with?
Well, I think that there's so many different aspects to this that it's really difficult to say. The area where I would have the most knowledge would be about communities coming together to interact online with big data. Interestingly enough, people think Wikipedia is really big, but in fact, if you look at it as a database and a quantity of information, it's actually very, very small. It's a few terabytes. It's really nothing when we think about the kind of data sets that we can talk about that are being generated in all kinds of fields. So for me, I think the technological piece of this, how do we develop the tools and the methods for thinking about and using really, really large data sets, and what does that mean for science? What does that mean for marketing? All those kinds of things. It's all very interesting. It's just not something I know enough about. What I would say is, when we think about human beings are who are going to use this in the end. And so there's a whole lot of interesting things that can happen when you can apply not just a trillion data points, but 1,000 minds. If you give 1,000 minds the tools to work really effectively with those trillion data points, you can have really interesting things happen. So I think there's going to be a lot of innovation in not just the data systems, but also the tools that we give to communities and to people in various fields to actually constructively use those data.
So, I mean, so far we've managed to sort of slightly improve on the Encyclopedia Britannica, arguably, through free labor, essentially, through crowd collaboration. I mean, what's the next thing that you would expect to see in terms of that kind of behavior, doing something quite...
Yeah, and that kind of thing, the things that I'm watching are, when we think about Wikipedia, all of the technology to create Wikipedia actually existed 5 years before I started Wikipedia, 6 years. So, web server, database, even the idea of a wiki, a website anybody can edit, that existed 6 years before, but nobody had really harnessed it to really build something big that really was inspiring, that got a lot of people excited and motivated to do this one thing. I always like to think about what technology exists today, and all the technical pieces are already in place, that it's going to take 6 more years for people to figure out the social pieces to do something really amazing, really interesting. And the areas I'm interested in would be things like video production. Right now, if you think about user-generated video online, it's mostly funny cat videos on YouTube. It's a little bit more than that. But what we haven't seen yet is large-scale projects. There have been a few, but they're still not, there's one 15-minute short that I saw that was created by the Blender Foundation, and it was 100 people worked on it as volunteers just for fun, and they made this Hollywood-quality animated film. I think in 6 years, we might see hundreds of similar things being done like that, as the tools that people need to use to create things like that come together, but also the social understanding and the friendships and knowing who, that you can do it. So I think there's still a long way to go in collaboration, and we've done the easy part, which is text. Editing text together is one of the easiest things to do.
Sandy Pentland from MIT Media Lab. I mean, what are your visions? Where's the next action on this?
Well, probably most of a decade ago, started looking at the digital breadcrumbs that we leave as we move around. So not text, but cell phone records, financial records, all the little bits that we leave. And what we found was that there were amazing things you could do with this. So Nathan was one of the early students in this effort. And what we found is you could do things like, you could tell when somebody was suffering from depression. You could tell when somebody was at high risk of diabetes. You could do things like, you could see indications of financial bubbles before they actually happened. So these are things that I call honest signals. They're behavioral signatures that you get from looking at people's behaviors that tell us about things that are important. And using these, it looks like you can do things like you can really revolutionize the health system, because you can find things before they get bad enough to end up in a clinic. You can help the financial system by looking at dysfunctions before they happen. And probably in the developing world is where the biggest impact is, because you can see when things are going wrong there. And recently, a lot of the government agencies who are interested in stability around the world are beginning to use these techniques, and we're helping them see, where is the governance breaking down before people pick up the AK-47s.
So give us an example of what you can see.
Well, an example is when people stop going to the market in Kabul, there's probably a reason for it. So
you'd pick that up with a Ushahidi tool or something like that, wouldn't you?
Yeah, but also there's a bigger issue, which is the same data is very, very scary. And so what you're confronted with is this problem that you could use this stuff for real public good, but it could also be used for real public evil. And so about 4 years ago, I started a project with the World Economic Forum to see if we could come up with a way to use this tool that wasn't quite so scary. And we came up with a really surprising consensus, which is that you should think of all this data as an asset and something that can be used, and there's a market, and you can have derivatives off of it, all sorts of things. But the first move is you have to assign ownership to the data. That's the part that's muddled right now. And interestingly, I was able to, with people like John Clippinger and others here, get a lot of the CEOs of these companies to agree that individuals own their data, not other entities. And that sort of move towards ownership means that you can begin turning this into an asset class, which means you can begin using it in a way that gives value back to the owners and yet finds the diabetics before they actually are showing diabetic symptoms.
And just one question following that point. What's actually happened in terms of implementation of that, giving the ownership to the individual? I mean, I'm trying to think.
So you're seeing lots of little bits. I mean, one of the most surprising ones is with Google. Google, who has been a core partner in this, first put up a website that lets you see all of your data, and then after our last set of meetings, put up a tool called the Data Liberation Front that lets you take your data back from Google and give it to other people. That's one surprising thing.
I've not noticed them advertising that in a big way.
Well, in the geek crowd, it's pretty good. But a lot of the big carriers are beginning to offer services like this now. So it's just beginning. And a lot of the international aid, international security organizations are beginning to use this.
Great. Stephen Wolfram, tell me, come into the conversation, what's your perspective on what the next challenges are?
I've been interested in doing something kind of crazy, which is to say, take all the knowledge that's sort of been accumulated in the civilization and make it computable so that if there's a question that can in principle be answered on the basis of that knowledge, it's actually possible for somebody to sort of walk up to a machine and ask the question and get an answer. Seemed like that was a project that might just be undoable because there's too much knowledge in the world, it's too hard to actually compute things from the knowledge and so on. We've gotten a fair distance doing this. I think the thing that we've really learned, several things we've learned. One thing is there's a big difference between pure data and computable data, computable knowledge. I mean, people say we've got this great database. They're very impressed by the fact that they've got a database. They've managed to move their data, for example, from printed form to electronic database form. This is great. The question is, what do you then do with this database? You can have an expert go and look at the database and do some kind of sophisticated academic thing with it, and that's terrific. But if you want to make it generally useful, you have to put something on top of the database. You actually have to make the thing computable in some meaningful way. And so we've now had the experience with probably a few thousand domains of knowledge of taking that sort of step of going from the pure data, the raw data, to something that's computable. And there are a few scary things. I mean, it's sort of 90% of the effort seems to be not just sort of snarfing in the pure data, but getting it to the point where you can ask a question on the basis of the data and explicitly get an answer.
Well, how's this different from Wikipedia?
I think they're very different directions. I mean, the very nicely complementary directions. I mean, Wikipedia is about casting into kind of textual form the kind of the pithiest, most sort of the best summary of some particular area, some concepts, some facts, and so on. What we've been interested in particularly is answering questions from underlying knowledge, questions that perhaps have never been asked before. In fact, the majority in our Wolfram Alpha system, we watch this query stream all the time, and the majority of questions that come in are questions for which there's no hit for that question anywhere on the web as an explicit searchable thing. So now, there are interesting sort of interplays between these things. For example, you can start saying, well, let's get some little nuggets of facts about things that are sort of, in a sense, pre-computable. They're still textual, but they're kind of nuggetized in a way that you can start to kind of bite into them with computational methods. But really, these are, I think, two different directions in what has to be done.
And sort of what percentage of the world's knowledge is currently
in Wolfram Alpha? I mean, it's very hard to assess that, right? But my sort of rough guide is, you go into a big reference library and you go and look at all these big shelves and so on. At the beginning, it was extremely daunting because, how are we going to get all this stuff? Now, the majority of bays in a reference library, we have a pretty good, chunk of that material. I think the thing that surprised me is how things that I couldn't imagine would be computable turn out to be computable. Like things about, I don't know, people, for instance. What's computable about people? Well, you start off by realizing there are timelines of when different people lived. There are sort of connections between people through things that they were both involved in. There are all sorts of, there are even things where, if you know about what cities people were born in, when somebody asks about such and such a city, you can say, notable people born in that city, those kinds of things. I've just been surprised at all these different areas. Another example, what's computable about a Shakespeare play? Well, now, I don't think it's yet live in Wolfram Alpha, it will be soon. You type in Hamlet or something, and of course you can realize that, there's this sort of little timeline of when was each character talking during that play and so on. It's actually a quite, and you can, explicitly ask, how much more did Hamlet say than so-and-so in this play? Or, in the case of Julius Caesar, you might see he was talking for a while and then he stopped talking, and that was probably something bad happened at that point. But I've been sort of surprised by how many things that I thought were kind of liberal artsy kinds of things where there would never be a way to sort of do something computable that turns out to be something computable to be done.
Yeah, I can't imagine that Shakespeare would be keen on that analysis. But it's sort of,
well,
doesn't it reduce it all to something less?
No, you see, I think this is one of the things that's fascinating about, you could ask about, web analytics or something. We see all these streams of data. I used to primarily be a physicist long ago, and I'm used to sort of seeing these big chunks of data, right? And it's an amazing thing that, what used to be sort of a good result in physics, where you say we've got lots of statistics, this is a wonderful, we've got a curve with very few error bars and so on. Now, the stuff you get in web analytics is much, much cleaner even than the things you used to get in physics. Of course, we don't understand, you get these beautiful curves. There isn't a good theoretical understanding of why the curves look the way they do. But I don't think that it reduces, you could say that you're sort of reducing all of humanity to these pure, detailed statistical curves. But I think it's an important thing, and I don't think it's much of a terrible reduction, so to speak.
Michael Hansen.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think what you just articulated, Stephen, is very much what the challenge is in healthcare, and this is sort of the industry that I'm coming from. If you think about it, despite everybody said about this deluge of data and information, the reality is healthcare is an area that is largely void of information. In fact, largely whatever is there is sort of chunked up and doesn't talk to each other. So it's a very, very compartmentalized data system, and obviously the US and the US administration, the current administration, recognizing that, put a lot of money towards creating electronic medical records, and this is a huge drive right now in the healthcare system. But to your point, Stephen, when you got all the electronic medical records, that's great, and hopefully they talk to each other, i.e. what happens to you and your primary care physician and what happens in the hospital is actually linked together, which it currently isn't. But even then, you still have the challenge to go into the library that you alluded to, and we have frankly populated over the last 400 years quite successfully. And to find the information, what's relevant for you in your treatment then, becomes extraordinarily challenging. And for us, really, the next frontier, and that dovetails with what you're saying, the next frontier is, okay, we're creating all these massive electronic medical records and data sets, but to help a physician make sense of whether this particular diabetic patient should now be treated according to protocol A or protocol B, we need to make the wealth of information searchable. In other words, computable, as you would articulate it. And to do that, we got to build an entirely new taxonomy on top of that world of knowledge that we have created, the thousands and hundreds of thousands of books and content. Now, that is an effort that's extremely time-consuming, and we're looking, obviously, of ways to seeing whether computerization or automation can help us do that. But without that, frankly, the electronic medical record is a deluge of information and not very usable.
I'm sorry.
So, yeah, if you've got a follow-up point on that.
No, I mean, my impression of some of these things, there are a lot of issues that are even going to get worse. For example, sensor-based data in medicine that people don't know, that there's a whole issue of how do you use that stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things that we've seen, we've ingested lots of sort of primary medical data. We've done some projects on sort of proprietary medical data sets. One of the things that is an interesting topic, maybe people have views about this, we've seen wonderful data that could really help figure out, correlations between symptoms and diagnoses, things like this. But it's data that's locked up in various kinds of governmental or commercial, healthcare databases. And so one of the questions is, what's the sort of societal mechanism by which all this stuff that, individually has all sorts of privacy issues, right, can be collectively made available for the purpose of actually answering questions that are important for individual healthcare decisions.
Question, who owns this data and how can we make it liquid in order to be able to figure out what to do with it? I mean, at MIT, we started this rather major initiative at reinventing social science, at reinventing health in a computational way that starts from these measurements that exist in our environment or from sensors as opposed to the traditional way, because it's going to take an effort like that to do what you just described.
Nathan, I want to bring you in. So what are you excited about in terms of big data and the potential of it?
Oh, look, I mean, I think I agree with every panelist here. I mean, I'm enamored just as Steve is with these beautiful distributions that seem to be coming out of a bunch of data from millions or hundreds of millions of idiosyncratic people, or perhaps words from Shakespeare. It does give us some fundamental insight into the underlying behavior of these systems. But at the end of the day, while it's great to get these distributions, as Michael was saying, what we really need is how to go from data to insight, data to action even. And I've had a little bit of success getting access to this data that is locked away. And the way I've done it is simply appealing to business principles. So going to mobile phone operators and telling them, look, we can help you better understand the underlying dynamics of your subscriber base. So give us your CDR, give us your call data records, and we'll help your business, we'll help your bottom line. And as a side note, we'll also help, if you're the mobile operator in Rwanda, we'll also try to better optimize urban planning in Kigali. So being able to start looking at how traffic jams happen and where to put in the next road light. Or how do you control malaria in places like Kenya? So working with Safaricom, showing that we can help their bottom line, appeal to their business interests, but at the same time do a service that's for the public good. Now the downside, and what Sandy alluded to, is that so right now I have access to close to 500 million data points from 500 million people who are not consenting human subjects. These are individuals who did not agree to be in my studies, did not agree to participate in this, in something that may be sanctioned by the Ministry of Health or not. And that is a legitimate problem. And I think so the way I'm conducting this type of research is not sustainable. And so the flip side to collecting this data, large data about people, is instead of going top down, instead of going to the operators and to the banks and to the governments, going bottom up. being able to start directly engaging with people, asking them opinions, asking them to collect data, and then ultimately incentivizing them, rewarding them to do that, showing them it's either for the greater good or potentially just giving them some type of reward. And so what my company does is exactly that. We provide a huge number of people in now close to 100 countries with small denominations of free talk time in exchange for data, in exchange for giving us information about themselves, or for the World Bank, we're asking people, what does a kilo of rice cost in your local market? And we're capturing huge amounts of data, but it's all opt-in, and we are directly compensating the people that are providing that data.
So, Jeffrey, you have this trust role at Microsoft, which is a company we all have to trust. I mean, how do you see the challenges, the opportunities, particularly the risks of this whole
I think
movement?
Nathan and both Stephen brought up some really great points around, in your case, about privacy. And I think the challenge we have here is that there's so much greater good that can come from mining these large data sets and so many really interesting, innovative things you can do with it. I'm very excited about the possibilities. But we also do need to take a little step back and just look at, to what degree are there potential harms associated with these data sets and the way they're mined. What kind of harms are we talking about? Well, typically they're discrimination type harms where perhaps maybe you don't get the job because someone found something about your behavior, or you don't get the insurance, or relationships get broken up because it's seen that you're collaborating with somebody else that you shouldn't be. So they are direct changes to someone's life. And so the question is, what can we do about that? A number of people have attempted in the past to what we call de-identify data sets. It's even harder when you have large ones, but I know AOL way back when tried to do that, and guess what? It was not that hard to, through looking at vanity searches, recorrelate who people were. But there's even a greater risk to atomizing these databases is this thing called a linkage attack. And that's where you have auxiliary data lying around that you can use to recorrelate. So for example, the governor of Massachusetts was part of a data set of this group insurance commission data that was all de-identified. And some researcher took the voter registration rolls and was able to co-link back to and identify the governor. So it's really not that hard, and it's really kind of, there's so many different crossovers that you don't even recognize, including time attacks. So for example, in Netflix, they offered $1 million prize to help improve their reputation system. They de-identified the database, gave it to everyone to play with. And then, again, some researcher went to a competing rating system and was able to relink people's names up because of the time that they rated movies. They were able to correlate that and re-identify people. So it's a really tricky business if you're trying to also at the same time address privacy concerns. Now, the good news is that there's some really interesting new techniques that are coming out that people are now refining, which include this concept of differential privacy. This is Cynthia de Work and other people like her in the research community. And one of we don't have enough time to get into details here, of course, but when you properly implement such a system, the privacy risk that you receive by being in the database is no different if you were out of the database or in the database. And the reason that's really important is because of something, Alex, you mentioned, which was the World Economic Forum's idea of personal data sets. And this idea of maybe people either owning their data or being in control of the data, certainly in control of their data, which means they're going to potentially need to opt in or out of certain kinds of experiences. Well, if they're nervous about, by being in a database, that they're going to have discrimination or be harmed in some way, they're not going to opt in. And we'll lose the benefit of these great big data sets. So if we're able to use techniques like the differential privacy to say, look, it's proven there's no greater risk by you being in this data set or not, that hopefully reduces the barrier.
I'm afraid you are, for me, you're going to have to go into detail a little bit and just explain what you mean by differential privacy. Is that going to take an hour? Or?
There is pages of equations, which I unfortunately can't go. I can show you the reference material. But as a technology, it's a really good privacy-enhancing technology that tries to get at not the absolute privacy goals that you have, but the relative privacy goals, that you don't want to make things any worse than they already are.
Differential privacy basically is your data really different than everybody else's? If it is, you're at risk because they can use that in various ways.
So if you're the governor of Massachusetts?
Yeah, or you're older than other people, or you get up earlier. There's many things that you could do that make you stick out. And if you do, then you're at risk of this re-identification and other things. And so there's technical ways of measuring your risk of being re-identified and compensating for that.
Yeah. And one other thing, there's this whole issue of the accuracy of the data itself. And if you start to de-identify or munge the data and fuzz it, you start to lose the ability to get the data you want out of it in the first place. The differential privacy techniques maximizes the accuracy while minimizing the chance of you identifying an individual within the data set. That's more or less what it does.
Well, spell out
It seems
a bit.
that could, I'm sorry to be a little technical, this is very interesting. It seems that could lead to some bizarre flaws or biases in the data set because the people who are strange because they're governors or movie stars or something probably have other different characteristics, and so you're going to get, it just seems
I'm not suggesting
problematic
this
in
is
lots
a
of ways.
panacea for everything, but as a direction to head where you can kind of decide what you're trying to get out of your data set, you can construct it in such a way to address a lot of the privacy risk and minimize it.
So if you can estimate the risk, in some cases you can do something simple like just have insurance. In some cases the harm is great enough that that doesn't compensate, but you have to know when you're at risk as a sort of the first
Very
thing.
interesting.
So spell out a bit, Sandy, you know, in very practical terms, you know, when we get hopefully to this world where we are given a meaningful choice about
Well, we
what
control
we do
our
with our data,
yeah.
we control our own data. What do you envisage that looking like in terms of how often we're making choices about how our data is used? I mean, is it just like tick a box once and then it's lost in some algorithm?
Well, there's a couple of aspects to it, right? From a personal point of view, you're going to have people who are helping you, like the ACLU or other sorts of agencies, including probably government agencies. And you're going to want to decide that one or the other has a good template for helping you manage your data. Because you don't want to
they'll come up with their own.
They'll come up with schemes
templates or
based
whatever,
on these mathematical properties that minimize your risk. And because they have different value systems, the schemes will be somewhat different. One of the key aspects there is that there's this network of competition for helping you manage your data. So, you know, people who do a really good job at it, and there are no bad things, they'll tend to take over, help more and more people manage their data. And the other thing is that, you know, there's a certification process that goes along with this that is called a trust network, where there are people watching this, people, again, like the ACLU, or companies, auditors of various sorts, to make sure that there's nothing funny going on. And a key aspect of it is you can't trust any one person with this data. You can trust you, but you can't trust any one person to help you or certify it. There has to be a network of things so that there's no one attack that will render you vulnerable.
And I mean, how far off is this that we're going to start having the ACLU come to us with a...
Well, you already see an ecology like this that has grown up around the Open Identity Exchange. So this is a way of certifying your identity. It has, you know, various authorities that, you know, compete to do a better job at it. And then you have small startup companies like Reputation Defender that are going out there and working for you to find all the facts that are out there that have leaked out and give you as much control over that as you can. And as this ecology comes together around the idea of giving you more control, they'll be able to do a better job. It'll become a more attractive proposition for yet more companies.
And do you feel, so go ahead.
I was just going to say that one thing that has been mentioned is this effort in our country for something called NSTIC, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, that Obama recently signed. And as part of its effort, there's the standing up of what...
Was that when he was confirming he was born in Hawaii, or was that no?
I guess so.
Yes, exactly.
You know, there's this, as Alex was sort of alluding to, there's this conceptual thing called the trust framework, which everything sort of lives within, where you have certain norms and the ability to measure whether you have good actors and whether people are doing the right things within a trust framework. Clearly, for big data to work well without there being a lot of consequence, it should again be inscribed in some kind of trust framework where people understand the terms of what's happening and they can, you know, interact with it appropriately. And per the World Economic Forum goals, you know, to create a valuation associated with data, it's unclear exactly how much it's worth or how that would transfer back to people, but they need to perceive that it's a fair horse trade at the end of the day and no one's taking advantage of them. Otherwise, you know, people start to feel bad about the participation, you know, that somehow someone's watching them and making...
So one of the other aspects that's really interesting to me is that, you know, the internet grew up without thinking about a lot of these things, and that's where a lot of the problems we have today come from. Another thing that they didn't think about is what happens if the government is malevolent, which happens in many parts of the world.